Handout today because what I want us to do is I want us to kind of imagine something to begin with. So if you remember, those of you who were here last week kind of reviewed some dominant ways to think about the Bible as a whole. And one of the top ways that I encourage people to think about the Bible as a whole is to think about the Bible as a library, like a collection of books, rather than the Bible being like one consistent book the way we think about a novel or something like that being a book. And then even within individual books within the Bible are also sometimes libraries. So they're collections of things that were written in various places and then brought together. Like, again, maybe the most obvious example of that would be the Psalms, where it's a songbook and it's different songs that were collected and placed in one songbook. But Genesis, in all likelihood, is like that. And it's like that on a couple of levels. So if you imagine, so Genesis is actually a very long book. There are many, many chapters to it. And if you were to kind of map it out, you could say that it's at least two books. There's one section that goes basically up to about chapter 11 that is the really, really early history, the really, really early stories. What Genesis is attempting to do is somebody lost their keys?
They'll still be here.
Yeah. Not in here, I guess. So what Genesis is attempting to do is it's trying to, and this is kind of, again, even though we're talking specifically about Genesis today, we almost always end up having to talk about the rest of the Bible in some way. Genesis is set up very purposefully as it's the beginning, right? And so it launches out its narrative with the earliest thing you could possibly describe, the creation of everything. And then that's bookended by, if you go all the way to the end of Scripture, Scripture is constructed in such a way so that it ends with the end of everything. This is something that has affected Western ways of thinking for millennia, because the basic Scripture of our tradition has this kind of beginning and end thing going on. Not all Scriptures have that. Some Scriptures in other religious traditions kind of will start in the middle, or don't have this kind of big arc of from the beginning to the end, but have some other way, cycles. You'll have some religious traditions where the time goes in a circle. There's reincarnation. There's things that keep circling around. So Genesis starts with these 11 chapters that are, what they're trying to do is they're trying to give essentially kind of like the origins of everything. And so you get two early chapters that are big picture creation accounts. You get chapter 1, which is a day-by-day account of the creation of everything, beginning from a very cosmic sense, and then by the sixth day all the way down to specific kinds of creations on an individual planet, ending and culminating with humans before God's rest. Then you get another creation account in chapter 2, which is more focused in specifically on the humans that are placed within the garden. And then you get this kind of second way of describing the creation that's much more focused in on those two human beings, Adam and Eve, and their descendants. And then after the creation account for Adam and Eve, you get a series of kind of like origin stories. And it's a mix. You get some genealogy. So interspersed a couple of times between chapter 1 and chapter 11, you get genealogies that take you, say, from Adam and Eve down to Noah, and then again from Noah to Abraham and Sarah. And then you get these kind of famous kind of origin stories, the longest of which in chapters 1 through 11 is Noah. So actually the overall account of Noah's family and the flood takes up a disproportionate amount of the first 11 chapters. About 4 chapters of it is devoted to that. And then you get some other smaller kind of origin stories like the Tower of Babel. And that one is setting up, helping to understand some other phenomenon in human life, the proliferation of languages and maybe also some commentary on theology and city building and the relationship between agricultural life and city life. But you get all these kinds of things going on. But then, at chapter 11, you get a major switch. Whoever assembled the final version of Genesis, when they put it together this way, it's like they turned a switch and they shut off the kind of origin story, early creation, almost kind of like mythic or cosmic ways of approaching the story, and they focus very specifically in on one family saga. So from chapter 12 on, you have one family story, and it sticks with it, almost to the exclusion of everything else. You'll have small little things that'll come in from the larger world, maybe some historical events that impinge on the life of Abraham and Sarah or impinge on the life of this family, but it's always told through the life of this one family. Even when you have something as major as going down into Egypt and encountering this other foreign culture, the Egyptians, the only reason it happens is because there's a family saga going on. Some brothers have thrown another brother in the pit. He's picked up and taken as a slave down in Egypt, and the only reason you end up knowing anything about this other culture is because we all want to continue to know what's going on with Joseph and what's going to happen to him. So the shift there, if you read the book as a whole, is huge. You opened up the book, you started reading it, you thought it was going to be about how everything got created and explaining some origins of things like violence in the world, or why there are cities, or why there are all these kinds of languages, or you think it's going to be a genealogy, and then all of a sudden, bam, you get, this is like 1,000 acres, right? It's like some kind of big, huge family novel is what you end up with from chapter 12 on. So anyone who's going to think about or write about Genesis as a really, really formative book within religious tradition is going to have to deal with the fact that whoever put Genesis together thought those things were worth smashing together, and that you could create one literary unit, Genesis, that has that as a beginning, and then this other thing later. If it's worth comparing this to some pieces of literature that maybe some of us have read, or at least we've heard of, right? So there are some novelists and other people who have attempted to imitate this in their own writing. I think one of the most famous examples of trying to imitate Genesis in novel form is probably say Moby Dick, where you get, at the beginning of Moby Dick, you get this massive sermon that this preacher gives from up on. It's a great story, actually, because the preacher, before they launch on their journey to seek out the whale, the preacher actually always ascends up into this pulpit, and when he goes up into the pulpit, he retracts the ladder on which he climbs up into the pulpit, right? Because the word is up there above the people, and then preaches a sermon. And then you get this you get this weird mix of really close, again, familial thing of all the sailors on this ship, but then periodically you get science. You get an entire chapter on how they would take the fat out of the head of a whale once they had captured it, and you feel is this a novel? What's going on here? This sounds like a scientific account of how you harvest whales in the ocean. And so you get this weird mix overall in the novel between those kinds of things. Another great example might be War and Peace by Tolstoy, where you got this long family saga, and then he finishes the novel, and you're like, oh, thank the Lord, this is finally done, because you've read 1,100 pages, except for then he tacks on a 200-page essay on war to the end of the novel, and a theory of war and all this. I mean, it's just how am I going to do this? I've just survived the novel, and now you're going to make me read this, Leo Tolstoy, So there's been imitators over the years that have tried to evoke kind of the sensibility of Genesis. But now let's step back to Genesis itself. If you stick with the first 11 chapters, it's the first 11 chapters that are part of Genesis that are the most conflicted in our culture. It's those first few chapters that are the ones that have energized a ton of contemporary religious debates in especially Western culture, and maybe say particularly American Christian culture, right? You have this tension, an ongoing tension between people who want to take the first couple of chapters of Genesis as a report of how creation came about, and then the tension between that group of people and then other folks who would like to say that the way we look at the world itself, and specifically as the way we have been able to look at the world itself through various kinds of scientific study, tell us the world came about. You'll have different kinds of folks like cosmologists or biologists or whatever that will have accounts of how the world came to be. And so in that sense, what you have is it's actually not a debate exactly between religion and science. It's more like a discussion between conflicting stories. Or it's a debate on whether the two stories conflict with each other or not, right? So you have one group of people who says, because we're able to measure certain things this way, because we're able to test certain things this way, because we observe the world to be this way, therefore this is probably how the world came to be. And then you've got other people who are saying, well, no, we'd rather focus our energy in paying attention to this account that we have within our religious text that tells us how these things came to be. So in some ways also the tension is, say, between what you count as a reliable source of information for how you're going to tell the story of how everything came to be. So when we read, and because we all live in that world now, unless we really closet ourselves off somehow, you can probably find some commune somewhere where no one's in that commune has been exposed to the modern Western story of how creation came to be. We're all living in the tension of these two conflicting stories. Well, there's probably more than two, but at least two conflicting stories of how the world came to be, right? And so then what we end up with Genesis is we end up with a challenge as Christians. How are we supposed to hear the two stories together? And it can be polarized or political, but it's also just very, very practical. So I'll give you an example of the practical. Last night we're having supper with our family, and my son pipes up and says, well, you know who the first humans were, right? So I was like, okay, I'm going to wait and find out what he is going to say. So no, why don't you tell me who are the first humans? Monkeys were the first humans. And I was like, oh yeah. And then he says, and then he starts telling me this story. And then there were Neanderthals, cavemen. And then there were another kind of I think he actually said proto-human or something like that. I can't remember what he said. But he had this kind of progression. And then there were human beings. This is his account, right, that he's learned. And then there were finally human beings, the first actual humans. And so he told this kind of story to me. And I had thought when he first said that question, who were the first humans, I thought he was going to say Adam and Eve. I really did think he was going to say that. But I've never said to him that Adam and Eve were the first humans, that I can remember. So the story that he's learned is the story that he's learning in his classroom or just things he reads. He may not have even learned it in class. I'm guessing he learned it from this book he's reading now about poop. He's reading a book about how culture has dealt with feces over the centuries. It's really, really fascinating. For example, you know that defenestration in Prague, where there's a famous event where they threw these guys out of a window, out of this high window? Apparently they didn't die because they landed in a pile of poop. But nobody tells the poop part because that's you're not supposed to talk about that in recorded conversations about Genesis that you're going to post on the internet later, right? So, okay, so anyway, But so now here's what I have to do on a really practical level. I'm the pastor sitting in the room with his son. How do I talk about that story? Monkey, cavemen, Neanderthals, humans, in relation to God, Genesis, the biblical account of creation. How do I talk about that with an 8-year-old? And I'm not sure we're always as creative as we could be at doing this. We set it up as a contest. No, it can't be monkeys. You'll even see bumper stickers that say, I'm not descended from a monkey, right? Or things like that. Or you see this bumper sticker kind of creation debate going on with fish with legs or fish with all these kinds of ways that we discuss this. But perhaps the more important way to approach this is to think about how we can creatively relate everything that we're learning together. So I actually, at that point with Samuel, didn't tell him that he was wrong. I wouldn't have done that. And I didn't even bring up Adam and Eve at all. I think what I'll do is I'll give some creative thought to how the next time we're actually reading the Bible, because we've got like a kid's Bible, and if the question comes up for him, how does this story about Adam and Eve relate to the thing that he had learned about Neanderthals and cavemen, and then we can kind of start talking about it. Okay, but going back to Genesis now. So what are we supposed to do with this? How are we supposed to think about the 6-day creation? This is a fundamental question people have. I had a friend, I used to have coffee with a Lutheran pastor in Cambridge, Wisconsin, who was ELS, Evangelical Lutheran Synod, which is more conservative than Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. If you know Wisconsin, that's relatively conservative already. And he literally believes in a 6-day, 24-hour creation. God created everything that exists in 6 24-hour periods. All of the pastors in his denomination believe in a 6-day, 24-hour creation account. And we would sit down and have coffee, and you would ask me, how can you be a pastor in a denomination where everybody doesn't believe, as a pastor, in a 6-day, 24-hour creation? It just boggled his mind. And every time he would ask me it, my mind would be boggled that you could have a denomination where every single pastor believed in a 6-day, 24-hour creation, because we have diversity in our clergy on this topic. You probably have creationists and people more influenced by evolutionary theory and the whole range. So here's my proposal for us, and it comes from John Dominic Crossan. He's a New Testament theologian, but I like the way he talks about this. He says that a lot of the Bible is parable. Now, Jesus told parables, right? So we know at least a little bit about what a parable is. A parable is a story. That's the most basic definition of a parable. It's a story, right? And parables, it's a little bit different than calling it a myth. If you called something a myth, in popular culture, when we say something's a myth, we mean it's not true. You made it up. A parable is true. So the other thing about a parable is it's a true story. However, the primary goal of a parable is not to be factual in the way a Wikipedia article is trying to be factual. It has a different purpose, right? So when Jesus told parables, no one, after he told the parable, would have come up to him and said, were there really 2 religious leaders that walked past that guy? I mean, tell me their names. I would like to do a news article about the 2 religious leaders who walked past the guy on the side of the road, and I want to go back to the town where the Samaritan lived and interview him, and I'm going to report this in the newspaper tomorrow about this significant event. That was not the direction that this went. The direction it went was into a discussion of how do you love your neighbor. Right? So this is what a parable is supposed to do. It's true in a different way. And since people know that it's true in a different way, they ask a different set of questions of it. So if we take the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and we say to them, we want you, whoever, or to the author that wrote them, we want you to have written this the way we write science textbooks, or the way we write newspapers. We want you to have written this in a way that's like a newspaper account or a scientific account. We're expecting out of that text something different than it probably was intended to give us. And that's, if we start with that approach, we're going to inevitably come out with the wrong set of questions and answers because we're approaching the text incorrectly. I talked about this last week as well, that one of the first things we always have to do with Scripture is we have to make sure that we have gotten the genre right, that we know what type of literature we're reading. And the best way to start to understand the Bible, given how old and ancient it is and distant from our culture, is to make sure that we are trying to hear it in the way the original hearers would have heard it. So we have to ask ourselves, did the original people who were hearing the Genesis account, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, would they have heard it as a scientific story that's lifted up in opposition to evolutionary theory? And the answer is obviously no, because no one was working with evolutionary theory at the time that Genesis was being written, right? So this text, these first 11 chapters, are being heard by the people who hear it for some other purpose. And the best way I can possibly do this is to say, if you haven't seen it yet, take time at some point to watch the Noah movie, and especially the scene where they're in the ark and the lights go out. Noah closes the hatch on the ark. The family finally sits down after almost dying, under this whole thing. And they sit down, and what they do is they listen to Noah tell the creation story. He just tells it, and then there's this really fantastic image montage that goes on in the movie where they tell the story with images because the lights have gone out, and so people are imagining him telling the story. And what's the purpose of telling the creation account there in the ship? Is it to make sure that his kids know that they know exactly scientifically how the world was created? Not at all. The story is told for comfort, to put them in a larger story, to say, this is happening to us now, but we're part of a bigger story of God's creative and redemptive work. That's what the Genesis account is being told in that context for. And it's told so that then those people who hear that story can tell it to other people. So it's also being told like a campfire story, right? He's telling it so that his kids and his family will be able to tell it at some point in the future as well. There's probably other purposes and reasons for the story, but that's the biggest one. If we frame Genesis 1 through 11 in that way and understand that, number one, it's like a parable, it's a true story, and that its bigger purpose is to set up a story of our participation in God's story, then we think about it very differently. And it makes us open, hearers of this story, to engage other stories and not have them be in opposition to each other. So the basic way that Lutherans and Catholics and a number of other Christian traditions think about the relationship between the creation story in Genesis and evolution, for example, is they're not against each other. There's considerable congruence. Just on a basic level, if you read chapter 1, you notice, for example, that the order of things and how they're created in Genesis, not perfectly, but largely matches the way cosmologists think matter came into being and ultimately the evolution of life on a planet and all these other kinds of things. Does Genesis 1 perfectly describe it exactly the way evolutionary theory describes it? Not at all. Is the general trajectory the same? Yes. And so you can have this kind of more open conversation. But then, if we think about it this way, the other thing that we can do is we can read Genesis the way it continues. Because the author of Genesis, by the way, there's this major theory right now, which most Old Testament scholars buy into on some level or another, that Genesis was actually written by 4 different authors and then assembled by a set of redactors into its final form. And so you can actually find Bibles where it'll identify and say, this portion was written by J, this was written by D, this was written by E, this was written by P, because the styles are different. And they're all identified by what name for God that author primarily used. Yahweh, Elohim, like that. Or there's a priestly group where the stuff that seems to be in the first 5 books is especially written by the priestly class or whatever. So there's this kind of theory that's out there. But nevertheless, ultimately we end up with Genesis, a book, so we deal with it as a whole book. If you deal with it as a whole book, then you realize the first 11 chapters, though they're the beginning, they're not the center. They're aiming somewhere. They're taking the reader somewhere. So it would be a really fundamental misunderstanding of Genesis and the Bible as a whole to think that the Bible as a whole is primarily aiming us towards the first few chapters of Genesis, because that's not where the focus is. The trajectory, Genesis as a whole, is moving us towards, funneling us down towards that family. Like, the most important thing in Genesis is actually the covenantal relationship between God and Abraham and Sarah. And then even that has a trajectory itself that's even more important, biblically speaking. The most important moment in all of the Old Testament, for the Old Testament, and around which the whole Old Testament focuses, is the Exodus from Egypt. So, like, again, if you were to survey Old Testament scholars and ask them what's the most important thing in all of the scriptures, around which all the other scriptures are kind of oriented, it's the Exodus narrative from Egypt. And so if you look at Genesis as a whole and you read it, you realize that's where Genesis is going. Notice what happens. So you have God's big picture creation narrowed down into a relationship, especially with Adam and Eve. Then kind of these fall motifs, Cain and Abel, the Babel, Noah. So this corruption or fall of creation, or falling away from the original whatever relationship with God is, and then a reestablishment of God's relationship with people after those falls in various kinds of covenants. You get an early covenant with Noah, the promise that God will never destroy the world by flood again, and then a more enduring covenant with Abraham and Sarah, where he establishes this ongoing relationship. I'm going to make of you a great nation, right? But then that has to be shown. So the whole rest of Genesis is the beginning of the story of this great nation that God is building through Abraham and Sarah. So you get like by the end of Genesis, you've got the sons who are going to be the names after which the 12 tribes of Israel are named, right? But here's what's fun about this, even within that story, you're starting to learn how God works within those and through those families. You've always got these issues, these major familial battles between older and younger brothers, between sparring wives, between all these kinds of things. It's a family saga in the sense that when you read it, you recognize all the kinds of weird stuff that's gone on in most of our families, right? There's this stuff that you don't tell in polite company about, but that you all know about has gone on in your families. Battles over property and who gets what after somebody dies, and just all kinds of the wackiest stuff that we do. It's all there. But it ends up in Egypt. And then the whole family, what's fascinating about this is this is the most important but least known part of Genesis, is Joseph goes down into Egypt, right? ascends strangely to power within the government there, then the whole family comes down. His father dies, and then there's a record of him dying, and they move into Egypt. So this covenantal people, because of their following this ascendancy of this one son, that's where they end up. And so all of Genesis, maybe this is the reason we don't know this part of Genesis so well, is it doesn't end tight. Like it starts so tight. Genesis starts with this really focused creation account. It ends in kind of a mess. So they just all moved down to Egypt, and then if you start reading Exodus, the very first thing is they skip a whole bunch of years, and we don't really know how this happened, but Pharaoh forgot about Joseph and enslaved all the Israelites. And so now we have to start out with Exodus with this other kind of story. So Genesis starts so in this nice kind of focused way and ends in just absolute, like, what is this? This is like a family saga gone Star Wars or something, right? Like, actually, that's a good metaphor for the way Exodus starts, right? We have no idea how this all happened. When you start watching Star Wars, you have no idea why there's this rebellion or why there's all this kind of stuff, but everything is falling apart and you don't know the backstory. If you start reading Exodus that way, that's the way it feels. So, summarize. Genesis is a cosmic story that has a family saga focus. And the family saga is leading us into this primary story that Israel is going to tell itself, that's going to be told in the next book, Exodus. And so it's all driving towards that. And if you want to test this out to see whether I'm making this up or not, read the rest of the Bible and see how many times any author refers to chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis versus how many times prophets, songwriters, or people who speak within the historical books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, etc., define God as the one who brought us out of Egypt. Like, just do a numerical count of the comparison between those two. And you'll see that the Genesis 1 through 11 is very seldom mentioned or referred to at all, but the Exodus all of the time, because one definition of who God is. In fact, when they learn God's name, it's in the Exodus, right? The true name of God isn't revealed until Moses' encounter in preparation for the Exodus. I mean, everything kind of, in this weird way, focuses into that. And it would be very interesting if Christians could shift our culture so that we debated the science thing less and talked about what the Exodus story meant more. Because that's what Scriptures wants us to do. Which is a kind of an interesting issue. Well, that's enough of what I had for today, and we got time if people have like questions or comments or thoughts.
Well, I was taught by that same pastor you had coffee with.
Uh-huh.
And don't see a real conflict after, you study longer. But there is the aspect of the fact that however it was formed, it was a miracle. And I don't discount the fact that my faith tells me I believe in miracles.
Uh-huh. So she said that she was taught by the pastor I mentioned when she was growing up, which they were all trained that way. I mean, part of that way of training was to all be tightly doctrinally together. And I'm not criticizing that. It's just a different way of being church than we are. But that she now has a more open view connecting the two, but still sees the creation, however you think about it, as miracle.
Right. And I can still say I believe in the 6 or 7 day, 24-hour day. And it doesn't discount the fact that, maybe we did evolve from something less than.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's a miracle.
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat in the sense of I hope I'm a good enough scientific thinker to say it could come along that someone has a better explanation for the way everything came to be. And if they could establish that on scientific grounds, then that would discount a number of the ways we currently tell the story. Is that a fair way to talk about the way science kind of works, right? I mean, we peel back the layers so even the things we think we've locked in on scientifically can be peeled back by more data or whatever. I would say both that I question the science story and the faith story if it's told too scientifically, and the bigger picture piece in Genesis, the way it starts is, and God created. And I think that there's plenty of scientists who can say that they trust and believe in the way that they observe the world to have been brought about, and can at the same time say, and God created, and they don't see those two things to be in like contest with each other. Yeah, that's a good point.
But I'm concerned what you're going to say.
Well, eventually I'll tell them that's not quite the way it works. Actually, monkeys went on their own track and humans are on their other track. And we're not actually descended directly from monkeys. It's a little more complicated than that. That's one thing I'll tell them.
I was hearing you say that the way people heard the story in ancient times, it didn't include this scientific framework. And then you talked about the 4 different authors of the book. And you talked about Noah telling this story. I'm wondering, the history of Genesis, do you think it exists more in like a book form or in more like just people passing the story along to each other? Like, what's the history of the story?
Yeah. That's a whole other almost kind of topic. Jared asked, what's the history between the oral, like these stories told as oral tradition versus recorded tradition, essentially written tradition, right? And pretty much every scholar of these ancient texts would say that aspects of them were probably oral before they were written. You know, whether it's the Bible, although later in the Bible you could actually say almost the opposite. They were probably written before they were oral. Like Paul's letters were probably written down first and then read out loud. So actually the opposite would be the case. But the Genesis accounts are probably coming out of things that had been oral tradition. And in that sense, you can compare them to other real early texts in that era that we have similar discussions around. So people have the same question about Homer, right? How different is the way this is written down compared to what they would have told around the campfire when they were recounting the story of Odysseus or whatever.
And the history of people engaging with this story is probably primarily, overwhelmingly through the ear.
Yes, because even if they had a written version of it, very few people read, and texts were super expensive. Like to actually own a scroll would be beyond the means of any household. So the only way you ever heard the story was either by somebody telling it or somebody who knew how to read that text and reading it out loud to you. Yeah, that's a really important. That's again why I like the Noah movies so much, because it shows that. It shows in living practice how you would have done that. Like if Noah was going to pass the faith on to his kids, they didn't have TV or texts or videos that they could show, and so he had to literally sit down, at night and tell them the stories. And that's the only way you could pass it on. And it's kind of a fascinating piece. Some scholars and some people who wrote even in the New Testament, for example, said that this may even be a danger, that sometimes when you write things down, it gets it away from the oral nature of it. Peter is worried about the tension between the Spirit and the Word, and whether there's a problem between the written Word and the Spirit sometimes.
How does all of this, how do you see it, all of it pointing to the happenings of the New Testament? Oftentimes, we hear that basically the Old Testament is preparing us for Christ's coming. And how does that, where do you see that fit?
Well, see, I think that's the reason why I presented Genesis the way I did today, because what I want to do is instead of have it be primarily a kind of a real strict this is how creation happened, and this is how most people think Genesis is. Like if you were to say the word Genesis and then have people quick to say what they thought Genesis was, I think the creation piece would come up really fast. The Genesis as narrative that drives us to another story, I don't know whether as many people would say that's what Genesis is, right? And the way this relates to the bigger picture story is, this is like, one of my favorite ways of talking about this is from N.T. Wright. He talks about the Bible as being a 4-act play, like a Shakespearean drama. And we're living the 5th act. And so when he maps out how to think about the Bible big picture, he talks about creation fall as being the 1st act. 2nd act is Exodus. 3rd act is actually the exile and the exilic period. 4th act is the restoration and the renewal after exile by Christ. And now we're living into this life in Christ that's been established through his resurrection. That's kind of how he lines it out big picture. So if I were to say, like, if you wanted a really simple and an easy way to think about how this relates to Christ, it is to say that big 4-act story, what the story we tell about Jesus Christ is he's both the restoration of creation, right? So the creation fell, and so we talk about Jesus as the new creation, the old Adam and the new Adam. And then Jesus is the living embodiment of Israel in the Exodus, being brought out. I mean, literally, like, they went through the waters of the Red Sea, and in a sense, it's like a metaphorical dying to one life and now living completely in God. And you kind of see these kinds of motifs running through Jesus' life in the same way those stories are. So in some ways, Jesus is the summary of all those big picture stories and retold again as a 4th act.
I've always struggled with the time frame of the whole thing from creation until present. Does anyone really know how old the world is? I mean, you hear people say millions and millions of years ago. I mean, I don't understand.
Yeah, right. If you do, what people get into trouble with is if they do the strict genealogy that's in the Bible, because there's these so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so all the way from Adam down to, so you can do a whole genealogy all the way from Adam down to Christ, and you can go from Christ to the present. You can do the math, and from that perspective, the world is 6,000 something years old or whatever, right? And then you've got people who are doing carbon dating and other ways of measuring how old things are, and they put stuff in the millions and billions of years category, right? And so you have that tension between those two stories. I would say my basic way of thinking about this is pretty simple. I hope. I would say probably up until Israel. So like when Israel is established in the nation of Israel, anything before that, we don't have solid dating on really at all. Those early stories, it's hard to know how they would even have known. And you get all this like kind of almost like, again, parabolic storytelling about the longevity of the lives of the people prior to the flood and all those kinds of things. And I just don't think that we have a good handle on how long and when things were. By the time of Israel, we have a good lock on the historical events because there are other nations around that are also recording events, and so we're able to, like, if you look at some kind of big like timeline for the Bible, you'll see all of a sudden other history starts coming in. So you can date events within Israel in comparison to dates within Egyptian history or whatever. But anything, it starts to that kind of dating stuff falls apart, at least in part because there wasn't many cultures recording anything or writing anything down. There was no alphabet, right, exactly. So that's kind of loose, and I just don't worry about it too much. Like, I think it's interesting, but it doesn't have to be problematic that there's a difference.
I was going to say, I think sometimes the way I kind of look at it is time is a figment of man's imagination. And we've made up time to be defined as 60 seconds and 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 hour, so forth and so on. We already know there's histories of different calendars that have been made up by man. We know some people in the Bible that lived to be 900 and some years, but we have no idea. God never wrote anywhere, this is how I define time. So I think, just like religion is not religion without some component of faith, I think Genesis, at least for me, is one of those areas where, I'm not so sure God wanted us to be able to figure it out, but maybe to keep asking questions, to keep searching, to keep seeking, to keep learning, and have faith that is there for a reason, and no matter what the reason may be, there may be multiple reasons why, but I think it's still fun to keep searching and try to figure it all out.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of cultures and this was probably my favorite thing to teach in world literature, but lots of cultures, all cultures have a creation story, and they all have a lot of things in common. But I think it's really fascinating because we have to tell each, we have to, like our brains naturally want to figure out where we came from and why we're here. And so I think reading other creation stories too is really interesting and looking for places where they match the culture they come from too. So like in South America, Latin America, one of the first versions of people, they were made out of corn. They're made out of maize because that's what they were growing. So if I think it's this essential part of human nature, we want to know where we came from, we want to try to understand it. When we don't have information about it, we latch on to the stories and we use those stories to make sense of it.
One last thing I'll mention, I agree with this. It's interesting to compare origin stories in other cultures to the biblical account. And one of the things that a lot of scholars of early origin stories will tell you, especially if you compare the larger, like say the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, to early texts from other cultures about how religion is supposed to be practiced or what religious life was supposed to be like, is the God of Israel was especially unique in this way. The God of Israel cared more about how Israelites treated their neighbors than about how the Israelites would pay homage to God. Most of the other religions around were very interested in how you would make sure you sacrificed well to God and lifted up God. And other religions, other traditions around Israel found their scriptures strange because you would find laws in the Bible about if you accidentally killed your neighbor's horse, you should replace it. And people literally would have been like, your God cares about that? Like there's this strange kind. And so it's kind of interesting to read scholarly work on this comparative stuff because it gives you some discoveries into how interesting our God is in relationship to Israel, that God actually cared about those kinds of things, like neighbor love and care of neighbor, and there's all the things in Leviticus about redistribution of wealth so that there's never this huge disparity within Israel between the rich and the poor and all these other kinds of things that the other religions wouldn't have had on their radar really in the same way, at least not that early.